Welcome to the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. Today, we are going to talk about if all this high carb intake is making athletes diabetic. It's a controversial topic. We're also going to talk about low carb intake for cyclists, and we have with us Dr. Kyle Pfaffenbach from Eastern Oregon University. Coach, to the stars, I'll just say. We've got the Brooks Beast. We've had tons of athletes that you've coached to pretty amazing feats on the nutrition side. That's where, if you don't know, that's where Kyle's focused, on the nutrition side. Kyle, let's get into Michael's question. You can submit your questions down below in the YouTube comments. Go ahead and do that now. Kyle says, I'm a 46-year-old male athlete with no pre-existing or chronic medical conditions. I'm a Cat 2, and that's in road, cyclocross, and mountain bike. I actively stopped competing in 2016, but remained active via casual riding, gym, and extensive ski touring. Kyle, is this you?
Seriously, this is like literally.
Yeah.
No.
Kyle and I love ski touring too.
My doppelganger. I'm also 46. So like, this is crazy. I was like, wait a second. I'm not a Cat 2 rider though.
Yeah.
Okay. So
I began training to compete in gravel races this past August and integrated contemporary nutrition theory as part of my program. Higher grams of carbs per hour, typically training and racing with 70 to 90 grams per hour. In December, I had a comprehensive blood panel, routine not related to any sort of illness, and it included my hemoglobin A1C. The value was high at 5.9. Following a brief call with my primary care physician, we both agreed that the results were likely a result of my increased consumption of simple sugars over the last several months. Anecdotally, I live in Boulder, Colorado, and my primary care physician shared she has seen similar results given the area's patient population of competitive athletes. Everybody's fast in Boulder. So my question, has Kyle Pfaffenbach seen similar results with some of the athletes he works with? I understand this is private, personal HIPAA information, so only asking for a very obtuse yes or no response, or you're going to get more than a yes or no on this one, in this case. But hoping to get opinion from an individual who has intimate experience with athletes and their blood panel info. All of their test results were normal. Glucose was at 85 milligrams per deciliter. I never know what to say, Kyle. Deciliter, there we are. And insulin at 5.5, and I'm not even going to go into try to pronounce that one there. Lots of little letters and big letters to mean it's normal. Okay, so this question from Michael. Kyle, he's not asking you to share the information of the specific athletes and their names, anything else like that. However, I have seen this actually with athletes have reported this before in podcast questions and in other things where they say, hey, I got a blood panel done and my A1C was high. Is this normal that do you see this in athletes that are taking in high carb intake? And is this theory of perhaps increased, in this case, like they said, let's see where I want to make sure I get the words exactly right. Both agreed that results were likely a result of my increased consumption of simple sugars over the last several months. So where do you stand on all this? Because part of me thinks, Kyle, that when your body is in an active state, it's going to deal with this stuff in a different way than if it's in a sedentary state. And if you're an athlete, maybe it's different, but maybe not. Maybe it is. Maybe we're all going diabetic with all this high carb intake.
It's a complicated question because first of all, A1C is going to be like, there's going to be some individual variation in it. And
maybe we should describe what A1C is.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, this is a good point. So type 2 diabetes and the prevalence of type 2 diabetes is relatively new phenomenon for the human race. Let's just like put it into major macro context.
Mm-hmm. First
of all, let's back up even farther than that. When I ingest carbohydrates at rest, this is the key. When I ingest a bunch of carbohydrates, say I eat a big pasta dinner, a big rice-filled dinner, I get a rise in blood sugar. So that carbohydrate goes down my esophagus, into my stomach, starts getting broken down into individual glucose molecules. It goes into the small intestine, gets further broken down, and then it gets absorbed. And that's when we're talking about carbohydrate intake rates and things like that, we're concerned with intestinal absorption rates and what ratio of sugars and all those different types of things. So I want to keep tying back to things that we've talked about before and like language that people, because I think when you talk about this in a more comprehensive way, it gives people a better mental picture of it. And so So it's in the small intestine. Now that blood sugar goes through the intestinal wall into what's called the portal circulation. And this is a very dense group of vasculature that runs from the small intestine uh, all down into one tributary called the portal vein. And the portal vein goes directly into the liver. So the liver has two major blood sources, the portal vein and the hepatic artery. And so the hepatic artery is kind of its systemic version of like things that are already absorbed in your body are running through the hepatic artery. Things that are coming in through the digestive tract are coming in through the portal vein. Basically, you fill all that sugar goes into your portal circulation, and then that goes into the liver. The liver takes what it wants. So this is called first pass nutrient uptake, and it's something that is sort of the liver is the big dog of the body. It eats first. And so it gets first pass nutrient uptake. And depending on the composition of sugars and the needs of the liver, it's going to basically meet its energetic needs and refill its glycogen. Because we produce the liver is the main organ that releases blood sugar during fasting and overnight and things like that. And it does that through a combination of being able to produce sugar from non-sugar carbon skeletons. This is called gluconeogenesis, or it has its own glycogen storage, and it will pump sugar out of the liver into the bloodstream to meet the needs of the blood sugar needs. If we're following this whole pathway and you're at rest and you just ate all these carbs, the liver sees what it sees. The pancreas actually senses a disconnect between the rise in blood sugar in the portal vein and a not as high a blood sugar amount in the systemic circulation. And that seems to be the sensor that turns on the pancreas to start producing insulin. So insulin starts to release there. So if you were to graph this over a time curve, you would have an individual eat a meal, and then you would see their glucose let's say we were doing systemic blood pricks, for example, or blood draws. Okay, so you're not drawing from the portal circulation. You're drawing from the systemic circulation. And what you see is like blood sugar will start to rise, and there's a little bit of a lag, and then insulin starts to rise. And then as insulin does its thing and blood sugar starts to come down, insulin starts to come down. And the reason why we say things like, oh, fiber is good for you, or eat complex meals, or add protein and fat to the mix is because those things slow that digestion and absorption rate. And it gives you like a more manageable glucose curve. So this is what we call like a blood glucose spike, or what's called the glycemic index, how much of food causes a spike. But like the GI of a banana is completely different if it's covered in almond butter, for example. Mm-hmm. So there's like, it's a little bit of a story here. And so what happens is that blood sugar raises, and then it starts coming back down in concert with insulin. The reason why I keep going back to this idea that the idea of being in rest is super important is because a lot of people misinterpret insulin as being just related to the management of blood sugar. And insulin is like one of the most powerful hormone in the body. Scientists will describe it as like when you pit insulin up against other hormones, insulin usually wins. If it's like these two things are present, insulin is the one that takes over. Like just the insulin signaling cascade, it's well characterized, it's well understood, it's very powerful. It's tied to anabolic processes more than what people realize, and growth signaling more than what people realize, because it's not just associated with regulating blood sugar. Because, and it makes a lot of sense that insulin's only released when there's high calories and high desirable calories, right? So high levels of carbohydrate and the person is at rest. And those two conditions are ripe conditions for growth and recovery. So you're getting so much more with insulin than blood sugar control. But what happens is when individuals are over-consuming in carbohydrates, they're over-consuming a lot of times in simple carbohydrates. So those blood sugar spikes are higher. and they're coming all throughout the day, right? So you wake up and you have breakfast, that's a spike. Then someone brought donuts to work, so that's a spike. Then you have lunch and that's a spike. Then you have like a Starbucks drink, pick me up that has all the flavoring in it and stuff, that's a spike. Then someone has like chocolate laying around, that's a spike. Then you have dinner, that's a spike. Then you wait because you want your dinner to digest. And it's instead of like coupling dessert with your dinner, you wait an hour, then you eat ice cream. That's another spike.
Another spike.
And so now you get this idea, right? Where throughout the day, you have this like significantly like elevated level of blood sugar. Plus you have this a lot of insulin. It's not the blood sugar itself that we're super concerned about in that case, because our body handles high blood sugar pretty well. People don't know when they're high in blood sugar. They know when they're low, but you don't know, like, you can't go like, wow, I'm really feeling like I'm high in blood sugar. Like, it doesn't work like that. We don't have the sensor because the body's built to deal with high blood sugar in under transient, in a transient way. And so it's like this temporary thing that doesn't set off a lot of alarm bells because it's normal. And so, but what's not normal is that number of times, that availability. And then the other thing is we're just hammering all this energy and all these carbohydrates, but it's not coupled with it's not coupled with any like increase in output or increase in utilization because individuals, the main thing that is tied to type 2 diabetes development are two things: obesity and inactivity. And so, or lack of physical exercise. And you typically see both those things, although some of them aren't related. Particularly, you can be insulin resistant and actually be pretty lean, especially if you're very inactive. You just may regulate your weight a little bit better, but you can still suffer from insulin resistance. This is my interpretation of this. And I want to be super clear. I probably should have led with this. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a researcher, but I did study type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, and insulin dynamics. That's what my PhD was on. And I did a lot of work in that area for my master's work as well. But this is not medical advice. This is just scientific information. So what happens is that if you're constantly bombarding the system with energy and growth signals, but there's nothing to respond or adapt to, those growth signals actually become a risk because you're just saying, grow, grow, grow. And the cell is saying, I don't know what I'm responding to. I don't know what the growth is. We all
doesn't know where to grow.
Yeah. We all know that just eating cow's meat doesn't fuse that muscle to your muscle and make your muscles bigger. Like it's
don't tell the gym bros.
It's not like you're not directly, like, you're breaking it down into its principal components so you can respond to the stimulus that you've applied to your system. But if there's been no physical activity stimulus applied to your system, then you have nothing to like kind of respond to. So like all your daily housekeeping and things like that and functionality within the cells is being more than met by fat stores and the carbohydrates that it's seen, but it keeps getting hit with this insulin signal, grow, 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 grow. Okay. And what happens eventually is the cell says, I'm not listening to you. I'm done listening to insulin. It's telling me to do all this stuff. It's giving me this growth signal and I have nothing to respond to. So it's kind of like, and there's so many different analogies in terms of like, and it's very reductionist, but because we're complex biological systems, not like mechanical machines. But there's all kinds of like, your boss is telling you to be more productive, but he's not giving you any, like, you don't even know what product that the company is making, but they're saying grow, grow, grow. So what happens is eventually the cells revolt and they say, we're done listening to insulin because this is risking us now. You're turning on all these transcription factors. Nobody knows what's happening. You're causing all these different things to occur, which bombarding a system with growth signals in the absence of a stimulus to grow is a risk for mistakes. This is one of the underlying like benefits of intermittent fasting. When we fast for 18 to 24 to 48 hours, insulin goes down, and insulin-like growth factor, which is an insulin-like hormone produced directly in the liver, those things start to go down, and the cells like have a chance to sort of do their housekeeping and not just got bombarded with and all these different types of things. And there's a gentleman I worked with when I was at USC named Walter Longo, and he has a really elegant way of writing and explaining about this scientifically. And so if people want to learn more about this, you can go look at his work. It's really, I learned a lot from him. And that sort of idea of like too much growth signaling and how fasting may regulate that growth signaling and how that may have implications for a variety of different things is kind of my focus at USC. This is in my wheelhouse in terms of that stuff. Eventually, the cell starts saying, I don't want to do this anymore, insulin. And insulin says, no, you're going to do it. And so the pancreas just keeps pumping out more and more insulin. And meanwhile, our blood sugar keeps going up and up. And for a while, hyperinsulinemia can compensate for an increase in insulin resistance. But the cells are super stubborn. They know what's good for them. And eventually you develop resistance to insulin. And and basically my interpretation of this is that the body would rather, it's basically saying having high blood sugar is less harmful than pulling all this sugar into cells and firing all these growth pathways just unregulated with no stimulus. Right?
Interesting.
And so it's like, a lot of people think of this as like, I remember having a really interesting conversation in a graduate class where the professor was leading this conversation about like, I think the topic was like, is insulin resistance protective? And we started having this whole like conversation about, well, what are the way, like, how is this explainable? Because we just think of it as being harmful. But is it actually protecting us from something that is worse because the signals aren't adding up? And this is why I like to describe it as like metabolic dysregulation as opposed to some sort of deficiency or shortcoming. It's dysregulation in essence. And so then you get all these different things. Now, insulin's really difficult to measure in the bloodstream. It just is. You have to take like full blood. It's not that it's not difficult. It's not as accessible as blood sugar.
Got it.
Okay. So when you get insulin, and again, insulin is so transient. It's counter-regulatory with another hormone that's released by the pancreas called glucagon, and it's moving around a lot. And so using that as like a diagnostic criteria is not great, because with blood draws, you just get in a point in time and it's hard to interpret it. There's a lot of really interesting stuff around like estrogen and testosterone now, where like we know what the shortfalls are of grabbing that at a point in time, and all the like complex regulation about, free testosterone and sex hormone binding globulin and all these other factors you have to take into account. So when you're interpreting blood work, they only have 2 years. Med students have 2 years before residency or before their first, their first, I forget what they call that, clinical, to learn everything they need to know about every human disease that exists and how to deal with it. Right? This is the job of med schools. The first 2 years of med schools is show up, take a whole bunch of books, put the funnel on the ear, and pour them in. And so they have to optimize processes. And so what happens is that you end up with these cutoffs or reference ranges, and you look at blood work and you see it and it means certain things. So A1C means this, insulin means this. But really, you're not taking into consideration individuality, and you're not taking into consideration, you have to grab everybody because you're responsible for seeing everybody and helping everybody's health. And I'm not faulting, like, we have to do this. So when you start just like kicking and looking at different blood parameters, but you're not taking into consideration, well, were you fed or fasted? Was it the morning or the afternoon? What was training the day before? What do we know about this? The strengths and weaknesses of interpreting this snapshot in time. Was there, all these different types of things. So what happens is that because blood glucose and insulin are so dynamic, and because high blood sugar doesn't come with a lot of symptoms, diagnosing and putting your finger on this like really, really complex metabolic dysregulated disease becomes very, very difficult. Right. So this is all still background and context, because the idea is like, and the other thing is this is a continuum. This is another thing. Shout out to Dr. Chris Melby, who I trained with at Colorado State, who's like one of the smartest people I've ever worked with. And he would kind of explain it as like, we have to think about these things as like on a continuum, not as a cutoff. But you just don't have time to do that if you're interpreting blood work or those sorts of things, if you're like seeing a lot of patients and stuff like that. So you have to have, at some point, they have to go from like fine to type 2 diabetic to type 2 diabetic, or to insulin resistance to insulin. And we use blood sugar, fasting blood sugar, as that cutoff. But if somebody's at, if over 100 or over 105 is pre-diabetic and under 105, 104 is not the same as 80. Does this make sense? You're not perfectly fine at 104, and then you get to 105 and you have full-blown pre-diabetes. Like, it doesn't work like that. But we have to define it at some point, so we can treat it and have a conversation about it and prove drugs over it and do all these different things to meet these criteria in order to kind of capture this super complex, like, physiological dysregulation or metabolic dysregulation. Okay, we good?
Yeah. This is all making sense. Yeah, it's good context to have to be able to understand this A1C value of 5.
Yeah, I think you have to have it. Yes. I think you have to have it, because
you have to.
When A1C. So really what happened is that I'll just say one more quick background thing. The gold standard for measuring insulin resistance is to measure when you infuse insulin to the system. So this is called hyperinsulinemic. One of the things that happens when you are insulin sensitive is that insulin increases the uptake of blood sugar from the blood into the muscle. It also suppresses the production of glucose by the liver, right? Because you have this exogenous source of carbohydrates. You don't need to be pumping it out. We want to be saving it for when we have a fasting and you need to pump that glucose out and raise glucose, increase gluconeogenesis. So the gold standard for this is called the hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp. And basically what you do is you hook a person up, you infuse insulin at a hyperphysiologic level, and that stays the same. Then to keep glucose within a particular range, you have to infuse glucose.
Makes sense.
Blood glucose. This is systemic blood glucose. Okay.
Yep.
The more glucose you have to infuse, the more insulin sensitive the person is.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense.
The worse that you are responding to that hyperinsulinemia, the less hepatic glucose suppression and the less blood sugar uptake into the muscle. So the less glucose you infuse. That's the gold standard for measuring insulin resistance, because you measure it over a 3-hour time period. When they do studies, shout out to my colleague, we were roommates together in grad school, Sean Newsom. He's at Oregon State now. He runs a translational metabolic research lab. This is their bread and butter. He runs these and he looks at, and when you use that sensitive of a measure for measuring insulin resistance, he's got some great papers that show, and I've heard him talk about this in talk. I think he's, anyways, I don't want to not credit someone else, but because a lot of people have done these different things, but I know Sean has done these types of studies where within 1 or 2 or 3 workouts, you see massive metabolic differences in a person's insulin sensitivity. It's right now. Because now all of a sudden those cells got the stimulus that they want and they're back on track. They're responding to that exercise. They're depleted in glycogen. And this is what Chris Melby would call, this is the flux story. So there's like you take a blood draw, you get a value. That doesn't tell you anything about the movement of the whole system. How fast is the wheel turning over? Right. And for cyclists, the classic example of this is intracellular fat, or what's called intramuscular triglyceride.
Mm-hmm.
Obese individuals and elite cyclists have similar levels of fat stored in their muscles. One, in the case of an obese individual, there's a lot of complications, dysregulation, insulin resistance that is tied to that high fat level. The other one, no metabolic issues. And this becomes a story now of flux, because there's turnover of that. And it's not sitting there to turn into ceramide and cause inflammation and cause an immune response and do these different types of things. The system is built to be more efficient by having that there. In the case of cyclists, over here, we're running out of places to store fat, and we never burn fat because we always have lots of insulin and sugar in the system. And so there's no flux, and now like, you end up getting fat accumulation in tissues that you don't want with no flux. And that comes with a bunch of issues. So the reason why this whole context is important is because when A1C came along, it was really a game changer for diagnostics, because what A1C is a glycosylation reaction. So basically what that means is that the sugars in your bloodstream mix with your red blood cells, and a certain amount of hemoglobin gets glycosylated, or you get a certain amount of sugar.
It's almost like it gets stuck. Is it fair to say?
It's an interaction, but it's not like it's not like enzymatically driven. It's more like if you think back to like 5th or 6th grade chemistry or 7th grade chemistry, where like if you put two things into a solution, they will eventually bump into each other enough to interact. But if you add a spinning, like if you spin it, and if you add heat, for example, you can maybe increase the activation rate of that energy. And this is essentially what enzymes do, right? They lower the activation energy for things to happen. So this isn't like an enzyme, as far as my understanding is. It's not like you get blood sugar and then we have these enzymes that are facilitating this. But they're not just like, it's somewhere between that and getting like just randomly stuck. Like there's actually some real interaction. Even if the meaning of it is not apparent to us at the moment, it wouldn't be responsible of us to assume that the body's doing it for no reason.
Got it.
Okay.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So you have red blood cells. Your red blood cells have hemoglobin. You have sugar in the system. They interact to some degree, and we can detect that. That's the key. We can detect that outside of the body with a blood draw. The other thing that's really important about this is that, red blood cells have a long half-life. So they live, the lifespan of a red blood cell is, 90 to 120 days. So basically you have this thing that isn't turning over at the rate that blood sugar is or insulin is, and gives you a better long-term point signal of what's actually happening over time in this system. So
got it.
Yeah. And
so if I
jump in.
Throw a 5th grader's perspective onto this.
Jump in.
If you're measuring A1C, A1C, it's type of hemoglobin, and it kind of serves as a map of what's happened over the last month or so, of what's gone on in terms of how much sugar it's been interacting with.
Yes.
And when you measure that A1C over time, that's why, and like for context, if your A1C is below 5.7, they consider that in the normal or healthy range. Yep. At least this is according to my understanding. And then if you're 5.7 to 6.4, it's considered pre-diabetic. And then if you're 6.5 or above, it's considered diabetic. You are likely needing medical care of some kind or another to manage that. But in the end, what you're pointing out is really important to understand that this is a proxy to help understand these interactions over time with sugar in the bloodstream. And if I'm a cyclist and I'm taking in, so this is, I guess, gets to the contextual question here, Kyle.
I just
if
want
I'm
to
a cyclist,
sorry, before we do
ahead.
that, I want to make one point of clarification, because you said A1C over time. So there's two over times here. One A1C measurement is used as an indicator of how much sugar was in your blood over time. Changes in A1C over time can also provide a clearer picture of what's been going on. And so in the context of
but you won't get that from a single blood test. You'll need
you get this over time with a single blood test. You get the tracking A1C, which is a proxy for blood glucose over time. And like, I don't want to get too confused here, but if we take them in the context of this cyclist, the question, for example, his primary care physician is being really comprehensive, because we have an A1C. We know it's a good proxy. It's allowing us to identify people that have dysregulated blood sugar earlier. And it's also giving us an idea of, okay, well, your fasting blood glucose may still be okay, but that could be like genetic. But if you're spiking glucose all the time throughout the day, and you've been gaining weight, and you've been feeling lethargic, and now all of a sudden you throw A1C into that, and we have a more complete picture about someone that's headed towards type 2 diabetes and metabolic dysregulation and that thing. But just taking A1C and saying, this is all we need to like understand a person's like relationship with type 2 diabetes is not what that was meant to be. But it was a game changer in terms of allowing people to catch more individuals on their way to type 2 diabetes, because maybe they don't remember to be fasted when they get their blood draw. And the reality is like a normal individual, and this individual expressed that, this is the first blood draw I've had in a long time as just a health related sort of blood draw thing. And a lot of people don't even do yearly blood work, let alone quarterly blood work, just to like check in. Right. And that's not like any shortcoming. It's just that if you get one blood draw a year, your physician is now required to tell you a story about what's been going on in this unfathomable complex biological system with this one little sheet of paper on this one blood draw on this one day. And A1C was a game changer, because like, you know, if you walk into a lab and you're afraid of needles, what's your body going to do? It's going to dump a bunch of glucose into the system. You're going to have fight or flight. You're going to activate. Now, all of a sudden, you have high fasting blood sugar, and you get diagnosed with diabetes, and maybe you just don't like needles. And so now A1C would tell a different story there. Because it's over time. It's a single point that gives us a story that's occurred over time.
And this is the crucial part to understand now with the context of a cyclist. If I'm a cyclist and I'm taking in 70 to 90 grams of carbs per hour, like this athlete is, and I'm training 3 to 6 times a week, is that going to give me an elevated A1C, or will the fact that I'm taking that in during an active state make it so that wouldn't show up in my A1C?
No, it does. And this is why it would kind of show up. And it's like borderline, no, because remember, we're not A1, you having glycogen on your hemoglobin happens. It doesn't just happen in people that are headed towards diabetes. It's a normal physiologic process. What we've done for the majority of people is we can use it and apply it as a proxy, like you said earlier, to tell us a story about what's been going on over the last 2 or 3 months in terms of sugar in the bloodstream. But it is not is not something that only occurs when a person is headed towards diabetes. And it's not in and of itself involved in insulin signaling and the insulin signaling pathway and insulin sensitivity and all those different types of things. So, and it's not even like we're getting, I think, a little too hung up on the 60 to 70. Well, what if I stopped doing 90 grams of carbs per hour and I went to 40 grams per hour? Anyone that has done, first of all, it's still, there's only so much bike riding you can do. Like, even if you're riding 30 hours a week, there's 24 times 7 hours in a week. So it's still like a relatively small percentage. And the other thing is that anybody that's ever used like continuous glucose monitoring or CGM will know if it's 20, 40, 60, 80, or 100 grams of carbohydrate, epinephrine and glucagon and norepinephrine are such powerful stimulators of glucose like release that your blood sugar while you're exercising is normally at postprandial level the entire time that you're exercising.
What do you mean by postprandial?
Postprandial means after eating. So like if you ate a pasta dinner, and you were wearing a continuous glucose monitor, we'd see a rise in blood sugar. Now, we're not measuring insulin there. We're measuring interstitial glucose. So it's not even coming from your blood. So let's say
there's its own issues there with CGM.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we'll see blood sugar go up and then it kind of comes down. And if you're at rest, that's insulin doing its thing. Now, if you hop on a bike and you start riding, your liver starts putting glucose out, your muscles start taking up more glucose. You have a higher amount of blood sugar when we're exercising because you want fuel availability. Yes, you have glycogen.
That's even when you aren't taking in exogenous carbohydrates in your drink. Your body just elevates blood sugar during exercise because that makes it perform better.
And then you say, well, why do we have to eat 90 grams of carbohydrates? Well, you're supplementing. Because what will happen is if you're counting on just your liver, your muscle glycogen and just your liver to fuel you when you exercise and you never eat a carbohydrate, well, what's going to happen is that the central system is going to recognize, well, we don't have any exogenous fuel coming in. We have this much fuel on board. We're trying to go through it at this rate, and that's not going to add up. And so you basically put governors on everything. So you have a rise in cortisol, which reduces the amount of sugar because again, your brain is not going to sacrifice its sugar for your quad muscle. So basically what happens is that the brain goes, no, this blood sugar is mine. You just generate power using fat, and you get maybe this much sugar. And so there's like this dance that's going on where you have so many resources. And so it's not, I don't want anyone to take out of this conversation, eat a bunch of sugar or stop eating sugar because you're going to have high enough blood sugar when you're riding. Again, blood sugar is where that is at the moment. It's not describing the flux of intermuscular use of blood sugar would be higher if you were taking in exogenous glucose than if you did a fasting ride. Blood sugar might be about the same. Okay.
Because your body's regulating it and using it. Right?
It's altering flux in different tissues so that it can have that. So what a lot of times is, and what we're missing is a lot of people are getting excited about the use of CGM in sports. But when you really look at it, it's like it goes up to the same level and it doesn't tell you anything about efficiency or fuel utilization. And at this point, this is my interpretation of it. Maybe somebody's figured something out that need to learn, and I'm open to doing that, obviously. But at this point, what in my experience we see is like you get this very predictable blood sugar level during exercise, regardless of how aggressive you're doing different things, because that's where your body likes to have it when you're exercising. And so if you're bathing in that for a long period of time and you're taking a high carb recovery drink and you're eating a lot more pasta and more calories, again, you may see this upward tick in the A1C that can be misinterpreted as this, because A1C is such a good, it's been such a game changer in terms of understanding people's like long-term metabolic dysregulation. that is so accessible because it's done in a snapshot, but it gives us information over time about something that's occurred over time, that it makes sense that the doctor would say, I see this with, and this is just a doctor, this is just an MD being good at their job because they're actually including A1C in this sort of yearly profile because they know it as a powerful diagnostic, but they can have the wherewithal to take it into consideration. Well, it's 85 fasting blood glucose. It's a lean individual. They're meeting all their exercise. They have no other signs of metabolic dysregulation. And there's a borderline increase. Again, going from A1C, uh, 5.6 to 5.7 may change the diagnostic criteria, but it might not change the physiologic story that's occurring. And so I'm not saying don't pay attention to this or don't like think about it in a complex way. I'm not saying that at all, but it in and of itself is just a marker. Doesn't mean the realization that more carbohydrates leads to better performances and people eating more carbohydrates on the bike doesn't mean everybody's headed towards type 2 diabetes.
Is a fantastic and thorough explanation of this concept, Kyle. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Because, and I mean, and I'm glad to have you on here because this is like your, like you said, your area of focus, and I think that shows in the explanation of it. This is a common thing that I say common. I should put that in context as well. The most common questions we tend to get are people always asking about like how they can get faster. But among the questions that are talking about any sort of like illness or dysfunction, this probably has to be in the top 10, top 5 of topics that we get in that category. This is, I think it's super.
It's a really easy place. So this shows you how effective some of the, shout out to my folks on the community health side of things, because it shows you how effective communication efforts to raise awareness about the potential harmful effects of sugar, especially processed sugar, and the overconsumption of it is. That for at a society level, and cyclists, our world revolves around bikes, but like it's a small knit group in the 7 billion people that live in this or whatever. They're
very different.
Exactly. And the 300 million people that live in the US. Okay. Let's just limit that to our, and so I'm not frustrated by the leap. It's a very, very, and it shows the effectiveness of those communication efforts to say, isn't eating this much sugar have to be bad for me at some level?
Yeah, it's good to have that question.
It's good to have that question because it just means people are thinking, it's even on the table as a discussion point. And so it's a huge opportunity to have a platform to kind of discuss the subtleties around that and these ideas of physiologic flux and those different types of things, because it is a really hard thing to kind of communicate. There's a sprints coach that helps with the beast and is a good friend of our coach. His name's Stu McMillan, and he had this really interesting Instagram post the other day where he was like basically criticizing sort of the rise in reactionary social media, where you watch somebody say something and then you pause the video and kind of roast them. And he's saying that just like isn't, it's not constructive in any way. And so we could like see the question and it'd be like, no, don't be ridiculous. You could kind of go at it. And so I'm really thankful for this platform to have like the space to let that topic breathe and talk about the subtlety of it and to kind of put out what my thoughts are about it. Because if we get feedback about, oh, you kind of missed this thing or some of this stuff, like I'm always open to learn new things.
Yeah. I'm going to recap this to provide some context. It's probably going to be gross overstatements and make Kyle fingernails on the chalkboard. But cyclists, you aren't the general population. However, that doesn't mean that you should just ignore A1C values. They are still what they are. They stand in their own context, and it's important to understand them as they are. it might be normal for a cyclist that is training consistently and fueling consistently with high carbohydrate mixes to have an elevated A1C. Or I should say you might see that more commonly than in others.
Yeah, and we're typically not looking for, like, if all of a sudden it's 9, there's something else going on. But if you're talking about going from 5.4 to 5.7, and now all of a sudden you just crossed into that high zone, yeah, we're going to keep an eye on it. But fasting blood glucose is fine, energy is fine, weight is fine. There's not massive alarm.
Now, where cyclists so a cyclist likely doesn't have to concern themselves with carbohydrate intake during activity that they're taking in being detrimental to their health from this perspective that we're talking about. However, a realm that cyclists, I feel, dismiss many times at their own peril is anytime off the bike. Sometimes we think that because we burn so many kJs on the bike, that off the bike, the example that you brought up earlier of, I have breakfast, and for breakfast I have cinnamon rolls with French toast. And then after that, when the donuts get brought in, I go, I burned, 3,500 kJs on yesterday's ride, a couple donuts. And it, when we start to get to the point where we are dosing our body constantly with this, not in pairing and lockstep with exercise like we are absolutely making it harder for our body to regulate have this whole regulatory process going on. So cyclists, if you're concerned with this, this takes an honest approach. If you feel that off the bike, you're taking in too much simple sugar that's going to be causing something like this, then absolutely that's something you need to pay attention to, regardless of what your A1C might say. That's just an important thing on principle to be able to make sure that you're staying conscious of that. And that's why you'll hear a lot of, like Kyle has recommended before, while on the bike, you may be taking in lots of simple sugars, that sort of thing. Off the bike, it's going to be whole grains. It's going to be carbohydrates that are going to take a little bit longer, like we talked about, like Kyle talked about earlier. Yep. And on that GI index is going to make it so that your body has some help in making sure that those volatile spikes become more moderated and consistent spikes.
I think that's a great summary. And I'm just going to jump in real quick on this, because when I do give talks to populations like we're doing right now, and even when I sit down with the athletes, we really do talk about sort of being conscious of how many times am I spiking insulin throughout the day by consuming carbohydrates at rest? And it's a good way to now think about, like, well, I'm hungry. A cheese stick has no sugar, a little bit of fat, and some protein. I can get a little bit of protein. I can get a little bit of satisfaction. I can get a little bit of calories. It's not unhealthy. But it's also not going to spike blood glucose. And this is one of the things when I talk to like local youth groups and things like that, and their parents, we talk about how, like, it's important to pair dessert with dinner. Not at one, you don't want to eat so much at dinner that you need to gear up again for dessert. So it's this natural way to, like, literally save room for dessert, which is probably more in your natural what I needed with that dinner. And then you couple that with dessert immediately so that you get it all under one curve, and it's well before bedtime and those types of things. And so that's this idea, if to put it in the most simple terms, what you just described very eloquently, is you can't outrun a bad diet. And people always want to know, I go to these things, and the first question I always get, what's more important, exercise or diet? And I refuse to have that conversation. I won't even entertain that question, because the two are so inextricably linked that you cannot talk about one without the other. And to do so is dismissing, literally, and sleep is in there too. You're literally dismissing a third of, like, the literal 95% of like what's going to dictate your performance and progress is sleep, training, nutrition. and
That's it.
consistency within these. All the other fun stuff about grams of carbohydrates and aero and lightness and bikes and wheels and all that stuff is
Training.
like, it's super fun and it's awesome and it makes a difference, but it pales in comparison to what those other three factors can provide.
Yeah. Kyle, this has been fantastic.
Cool.
We're going to save the keto question. And for the athlete Mache who set that in, we will cover that one on the next one. Because man, we just covered that one so way more thoroughly than I thought I would have. And it was fantastic.
Good.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can let us know down in the comments below. We typically do episodes that are more focused on the training side of things and everything else and analyzing athletes' careers. These days, at least our podcast does that. But every once in a while, we still want to bring you with actual experts. We want to, and people that are like boots on the ground. We want to bring you content like this. If you enjoyed it or appreciated it, let us know, because then that's a signal to us that we then need to, kind of like the insulin and glucose thing, we need to respond to that signal and adjust. So let us know. Go sign up for TrainerRoad if you want to get faster. We have so many people. I just saw a guy write a review this morning, came through, and he was like, it's raised my FTP 40 watts in 4 months. He's like, what else is there to say?
That's
Athletes
so cool.
all around the world are getting faster with it all the time. It just works. There's no gimmicks. There's no weirdness. There's no us trying to take ChatGPT and then call it our own AI. We build our own models to be able to analyze all this with a massive database of athletes of all abilities. So then that way it can make you faster. So go sign up. We'll talk to you all next time. Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you.